The governor who abandoned his state to follow a love he could never admit. The marble halls of the state capitol echoed with Governor Marcus Stanford's measured footsteps as he made his way to the press room, each click of his Italian leather shoes a countdown to the biggest lie of his political career. At 52, he had mastered the art of public performance. The perfect smile, the authoritative yet approachable stance, the silver hair artfully styled to project both experience and vitality. His image consultant, Sarah Chen, had spent an hour that morning ensuring his appearance hit all the right notes. The subtle blue tie that polls showed inspired trust, the tailored suit that made him look powerful but not unapproachable. Even the slight hint of grey at his temples left, deliberately uncolored to add gravitas. But today, for the first time in his 20-year political career, Marcus felt the weight of deception like a physical burden, pressing down on his shoulders as he approached the podium. Behind him, his wife Vivian took her usual position, a study in elegant restraint in her cream Chanel suit and pearl necklace. They had perfected this tableau over 15 years of marriage, the devoted political couple, childless but dedicated to serving their state's families. Vivian's blonde hair caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the press room, her practiced smile never wavering as cameras began to flash. She had been essential to his rise in politics, the perfect partner in their carefully choreographed dance of power. But Marcus couldn't help wondering if she could sense that something was different today, if she could feel the seismic shift that was about to reshape their carefully constructed world. Her manicured hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a gesture photographers love to capture, but he noticed it felt colder than usual. "My fellow citizens," Marcus began, his deep voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "I stand before you today to announce that I will be taking a brief personal retreat." The words flowed smoothly, rehearsed to perfection in his private office that morning. In these challenging times, it's essential for leaders to maintain clarity of purpose and spiritual centeredness. "I will be spending the next week in silent meditation at a retreat in the Rocky Mountains, reflecting on the best path forward for our great state." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but his delivery was flawless. He had always been good at this part. The public performance, the careful manipulation of truth, it was what had made him such a successful politician, and what had made Senator Richard Holloway take him under his wing all those years ago. Senator Holloway watched from the back of the room, his weathered face betraying nothing but supportive interest. At 72, he was the ultimate political survivor, a kingmaker who had guided Marcus's career from state legislature to governorship. Their relationship had been more than mentorship. Holloway had shaped Marcus's entire political identity, teaching him the delicate art of power. But now, as Marcus felt the older man's sharp eyes studying him, he wondered how much his mentor suspected. Holloway had an almost supernatural ability to smell political danger, and Marcus knew he hadn't imagined the warning in their conversation yesterday. "Be careful of distractions, my boy. Everything we've built is too important to risk on impulse." The questions from the press corps were predictable, easily deflected, with practiced responses about the importance of leadership and spiritual renewal. But when Angela Martinez from the State Tribune stood up, Marcus felt a momentary tension. She had been asking increasingly pointed questions lately, and there was something in her expression today that made him uneasy. "Governor, there are rumors that this retreat coincides with a series of mysterious meetings you've had with an investigative journalist. Would you care to comment?" The room grew quieter, and Marcus felt Vivian's fingers tighten almost imperceptibly on his shoulder. He forced a laugh, the sound natural and dismissive. "I meet with journalists every day, Ms. Martinez. It's part of maintaining transparency in government, but this retreat is purely personal, a chance to recharge and reflect." Back in his office, Marcus loosened his tie and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, allowing himself a moment of truth in the privacy of his sanctuary. The crystal tumbler felt cool against his palm as he walked to the window, looking out over the capital city he had served for so long. The skyline was familiar, every building and street a reminder of his accomplishments, his promises, his compromises. But lately, it had all started to feel hollow, like a beautiful stage set with nothing behind it. He took a slow sip of bourbon, letting the warm liquid burn away the aftertaste of lies, and thought of Camilla. Even just her name in his mind sent a dangerous thrill through his body. She was everything his careful world wasn't: passionate, authentic, fearlessly truthful. David Chen, his chief of staff, entered without knocking, a privilege earned through years of absolute loyalty. "Everything's arranged, sir," he said, placing a burner phone on the desk with practiced discretion. David had always been the perfect political operative, intelligent enough to anticipate problems but wise enough to never ask unnecessary questions. But today, there was something in his eyes, concern perhaps, or disappointment. "The private jet is fueled and waiting. Security has been arranged for your retreat." The slight pause before the last word spoke volumes, and Marcus wondered if David had finally encountered a deception he couldn't justify in the name of political necessity. "Thank you, David," Marcus replied, dismissing him with a nod. "I trust your discretion, as always." The burner phone buzzed almost immediately with a message that made his heart race. "Villa secured. Sunset will be beautiful tonight." Marcus closed his eyes, allowing himself to imagine what awaited him, not the cold serenity of a mountain retreat, but the warm passion of a beachfront villa in Tulum. He could almost feel the ocean breeze, taste the salt air, see Camilla waiting for him with that mix of challenge and desire that had upended his world 3 months ago. The memory of their last encounter flooded his senses, her lips on his neck, her fingers tangled in his perfectly styled hair, her voice whispering truth against his skin. "You're not happy, Marcus. You haven't been happy for years." She had seen through every layer of political polish to the man underneath, and instead of being repulsed, she had wanted more. The day wound down with the precise timing of a political choreography Marcus had mastered years ago. His security detail would escort him to the private airstrip, where they believed he would board a small plane to Colorado. His official phones would be turned off, standard practice for a spiritual retreat. Every detail had been arranged, every loose end tied up, every potential question anticipated and answered. Yet as he prepared to leave his office, Senator Holloway appeared in the doorway one final time, his tall frame silhouetted against the evening light. "A word of advice, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying decades of political maneuvering. "Power is a jealous mistress. She doesn't tolerate competitors." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with threat and history. Marcus met his mentor's gaze steadily, years of political training keeping his expression neutral. "I'll remember that, Richard." But for the first time, the old man's attempt at manipulation felt obvious, almost crude. As his car pulled away from the Capitol building, Marcus watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors he would soon see over the Caribbean, but with Camilla in his arms instead of political ambition in his heart. His wedding ring felt heavy on his finger, a golden shackle to a life that no longer felt real. In 12 hours, he would be in Mexico, trading power for passion, certainty for chaos, and his perfectly constructed life for something dangerously authentic. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. As the city receded behind him, Marcus touched the burner phone in his pocket and allowed himself a small, secret smile. For once, he wasn't following a political strategy or playing a role. He was following his heart, and it was leading him straight into a storm that would either destroy everything he'd built or set him free. 3 months earlier, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the dossier on Camilla Estrada, the journalist who had been making waves with her investigations into campaign finance irregularities. Her credentials were impressive: Columbia School of Journalism, Pulitzer nomination for exposing corruption in the energy sector, reputation for being relentless in pursuit of truth. David had advised against granting her an interview, but Marcus had built his career on appearing transparent while revealing nothing. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk as he prepared for what he assumed would be another routine exercise in political deflection. He hadn't expected the woman who walked through his door to change everything. Camila Estrada entered his office with quiet confidence, her dark hair pulled back in a professional twist that didn't quite contain its natural wave. She wore a charcoal grey suit that managed to be both proper and subtly defiant, like its wearer. At 35, she carried herself with the assurance of someone who had earned every accomplishment through merit rather than connection. Marcus rose to greet her, extending his hand with his practiced politician's smile. But when their eyes met, something shifted in the carefully controlled atmosphere of his office. Her grip was firm, her gaze direct and challenging. "Thank you for making time to see me, Governor Stanford," she said, her voice carrying a hint of irony that suggested she knew exactly how many people had tried to prevent this meeting. The interview started conventionally enough, with standard questions about campaign finance that Marcus deflected with well-rehearsed answers. But unlike most journalists who would accept his polished responses and move on, Camila pressed harder, her questions becoming more precise, more targeted. "You've stated that all campaign donations were properly vetted, Governor," she said, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "But can you explain why 3 shell companies, all sharing the same address in the Cayman Islands, each donated the maximum legal amount on the same day?" Marcus felt a flicker of unease. He hadn't been briefed on this detail. As he formulated a response, he found himself distracted by the way she leaned forward slightly, her intensity both unsettling and strangely exciting. "Let's be honest, Governor Stanford," Camila continued, ignoring his attempt to redirect the conversation. "We both know these donations weren't random coincidences. The question is, did you knowingly accept them, or is someone using your campaign for something bigger?" There was something in her tone, not accusation, but a genuine desire to understand, that made Marcus pause. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to tell the truth, to share his growing suspicions about certain aspects of his campaign financing that Senator Holloway had always assured him were standard practice. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Ms. Estrada, would you like to continue this discussion over dinner? Purely to provide more context, of course." The words surprised them both. Marcus hadn't deviated from his personal or political script in years, and Camila clearly hadn't expected such a direct approach. A moment of charged silence filled the office as they evaluated each other. "That would be inappropriate, Governor," she finally replied, but her slight smile suggested interest rather than offense. "I don't mix personal and professional matters." Yet she made no move to leave, instead crossing her legs in a way that drew his attention to the subtle sophistication of her heels. "Then perhaps coffee," he heard himself say, "in a public place. You can ask your questions and I can provide that context." This time her smile widened fractionally. Coffee might be acceptable. They met the next afternoon at a small cafe in the Arts District, far from the usual political haunts. Marcus had dressed down slightly, losing the tie but keeping the tailored suit that was his armor. Camila arrived in jeans and a silk blouse that somehow made her look more elegant than their formal meeting. The cafe was busy enough to provide privacy in plain sight, their conversation hidden beneath the hum of other patrons and the hiss of espresso machines. As they talked, the pretense of a formal interview gradually faded. Camila's questions about campaign finance led to broader discussions about power, responsibility, and the compromises that came with public service. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself engaged in a real conversation rather than a strategic exchange. The afternoon stretched into evening, coffee cups replaced by wine glasses as they moved to a nearby wine bar. The transition happened so naturally that Marcus barely registered the impropriety. Camila's professional reserve had softened, revealing a sharp wit and passionate idealism that both challenged and attracted him. She told him about growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, fighting her way through elite institutions on pure talent and determination. He found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone: his early idealism, his growing disillusionment with political reality, his fears about the direction of his party under Holloway's influence. When their hands touched briefly across the table, the contact sent an electric current through his body that had nothing to do with wine. Later, walking her to her car in the gathering dusk, Marcus felt an unfamiliar sensation: regret that the evening was ending. They paused beside her modest hybrid, a deliberate choice for an environmental journalist, he guessed, and the air between them grew charged with unspoken possibilities. "This was illuminating, Governor," Camilla said, her voice soft but professional, "but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still investigating your campaign." He nodded, respecting her integrity, even as he admired the way the streetlights played across her features. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the masks they both wore slipped slightly. Then she was in her car, driving away, leaving Marcus with a dangerous mix of attraction and unease. Over the next few weeks, they maintained the pretense of a professional relationship, scheduling follow-up interviews that somehow always ran long, always evolved into deeper conversations. Each meeting was a dance of attraction and restraint, professional ethics wrestling with growing personal connection. Marcus found himself looking forward to their encounters with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. He noticed small details about her: the way she absently twisted a silver ring when deep in thought, how her accent became slightly more pronounced when passionate about a topic, the subtle scent of jasmine that lingered in his office after their meetings. Each detail added to a growing obsession that he knew could destroy everything he'd built. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be their final interview. Camilla had arrived late in the day, after most of the staff had left. The setting sun bathed his office in golden light as she confronted him with evidence of larger irregularities in his campaign financing. But instead of the usual political dance, Marcus found himself moving closer to her, drawn by the passion in her voice, the fire in her eyes as she argued for truth over expedience. "Why do you stay in this system if you can see how corrupt it is?" she demanded, her professional distance cracking to reveal genuine frustration. He shouldn't have touched her, just a hand on her arm, meant to be reassuring. But the contact sparked something neither of them could control. The kiss that followed was inevitable, explosive, and absolutely fatal to their pretense of professional distance. The private airstrip glowed like a ribbon of stars in the gathering darkness, runway lights stretching into the distance like a path to another life. Marcus sat in the back of his official SUV, watching his security detail scan the perimeter one final time. Everything had been arranged with the precision of a military operation. The decoy flight plan to Colorado, the private jet registered to a shell corporation, the carefully constructed alibi of a spiritual retreat. Yet as he waited for the signal to board, his thoughts kept returning to the moment in his office just hours ago when he'd said goodbye to David. His chief of staff had handed him the burner phone with an expression that spoke volumes: concern, disappointment, and something that might have been understanding. "Whatever happens, sir," David had said quietly, "it's been an honor." Those words felt more like a farewell than a temporary goodbye. The weight of his wedding ring seemed to increase with each passing minute. Marcus twisted it absently, remembering his last interaction with Vivian earlier that day. She had adjusted his tie before the press conference with practiced efficiency, her fingers lingering slightly longer than necessary. "Just make sure it's worth it," she had murmured, so softly he almost missed it. The comment had frozen him in place, but she had already turned away, resuming her role as the perfect political wife. Now, sitting in the darkness of the SUV, he wondered how long she had known. About Camilla, about his growing disillusionment, about all of it. Their marriage had been a partnership of ambition rather than love, but there had always been respect, understanding. He hoped she would forgive him, eventually. The burner phone vibrated in his pocket, displaying a message that made his heart race. "The ocean is calling your name. Don't keep it waiting." Camilla's words, simple as they were, carried the promise of everything he was risking his career for: passion, truth, a chance to be something more than a carefully constructed political image. He could almost feel her lips on his neck, taste the forbidden sweetness of their stolen moments in his office, in discreet hotel rooms, in the shadows of a life he was about to abandon. The memory of their last encounter burned in his mind, her fingers tangled in his hair, her voice urgent against his skin. "Choose me, choose us, choose truth." He had promised her he would. Now it was time to prove it. His security detail coordinator, Mike Thompson, approached the SUV with the measured steps of someone who had spent 20 years protecting politicians. "We're clear, sir. The jet is ready." Mike had been with Marcus since his days as State Attorney General, and there was something in his eyes tonight that suggested he knew this was more than a routine trip. The older man helped Marcus with his bags, his movements deliberate and professional as always. But as they reached the jet's stairs, Mike paused. "Sometimes, sir," he said carefully, "the best security isn't about protection. It's about finding something worth protecting." Before Marcus could respond, Mike had resumed his professional demeanor. But the message was clear. Another person in his life seemed to understand more than they let on. The interior of the private jet was a study in luxury, all cream leather and polished wood. But Marcus barely noticed it as he settled into his seat. His mind was already racing ahead to Tulum, to the beachfront villa where Camilla waited. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, professional and discreet. "Weather looks clear all the way to Colorado, Governor." The lie was necessary. Even the flight crew believed they were headed to the Rockies. Only once they were airborne would the real flight plan be revealed. As the engines hummed to life, Marcus closed his eyes and let the vibrations wash through him. Each minute brought him closer to freedom, but also closer to the point of no return. Senator Holloway's final warning echoed in his mind as the jet accelerated down the runway. Power is a jealous mistress. His mentor had built Marcus's career from the ground up, teaching him every trick, every manipulation, every subtle art of political survival. But Holloway had never taught him how to be free, how to be real, how to love something more than power. The jet lifted off smoothly, banking into the night sky, and Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, even as new anxieties settled in his stomach. He was leaving behind more than just a position. He was abandoning an entire system of influence and protection that Holloway had spent decades creating. The old man would not forgive such betrayal easily. Somewhere in the darkness below, Marcus knew the political machine was already moving. David would be implementing the communications blackout, citing the governor's need for spiritual solitude. Vivian would be attending the charity gala, maintaining their social obligations with perfect grace. The press corps would be filing their stories about the governor's retreat, most of them recycling the official statement without question. But Angela Martinez from the Tribune, she would be digging deeper, asking questions, following leads. She had been too interested in his connection to Camilla during the press conference. How long before she found something concrete? The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt an almost giddy sense of relief. Let the truth come out. He was tired of lies. The burner phone buzzed again, this time with a photo that made his breath catch. Camilla on their villa's balcony, silhouetted against a Mexican sunset, her hair wild in the ocean breeze. The image was like a glimpse into another world, one of passion instead of politics, truth instead of manipulation, love instead of power. Marcus studied her outline in the fading light, remembering how she had challenged him in that first interview, how she had seen through every political facade to the man underneath. "Your whole life is a performance," she had told him once, her fingers tracing the lines of tension in his face. "When was the last time you did something real?" Tonight was his answer. Finally, he was choosing reality over appearance, heart over ambition. As the jet cruised south toward Mexico, Marcus watched lightning flash in distant clouds, nature's own rebellion against darkness. He thought about the evidence Camilla had uncovered in her investigation, the web of shell companies, the suspicious donations, the tangled threads that all led back to Senator Holloway. She had promised to show him everything once he arrived, to help him understand just how deep the corruption went. Part of him dreaded what he would learn, but a stronger part thrilled at the prospect of finally facing the truth. Whatever Holloway had built, whatever system of power and manipulation Marcus had been part of, it was time for it all to end. Let the lightning come. Let the storm break. He was ready for whatever consequences awaited him in the warm Mexican night. The pilot's voice returned, announcing their gradual descent toward Cancun International Airport. In less than an hour, he would be with Camilla, trading his controlled political world for her passionate embrace. Marcus touched the burner phone one last time, sending a final message before they landed, almost there, ready to be real. As the jet began its descent, he watched the lights of the Mexican coast appear below like a string of promises. Somewhere down there, past the airport and the tourist zones, past the carefully maintained facades that reminded him too much of his own life, Camilla waited in their beachfront villa. She was his future now, dangerous, beautiful, and absolutely worth every risk. The wheels touched down on foreign soil, and Marcus Stanford, governor of his state, master of political calculation, felt his heart soar with a feeling he had almost forgotten: freedom. The Tulum night wrapped around Marcus like a warm embrace as he stepped out of the black SUV, the air heavy with salt and promise. Bougainvillea cascaded down white walls ahead of him, their magenta blooms luminous in the moonlight. The villa rose before him like something from a dream, modern lines softened by tropical foliage, the sound of waves providing a constant reminder of how far he'd come from the marble halls of power. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, soft light spilled onto the beach, and there, silhouetted against the glow, stood Camilla. She hadn't noticed him yet, her attention focused on the dark horizon where the Caribbean met the star-studded sky. The sight of her made his heart race with equal parts desire and terror. Everything he had risked, everything he might lose, crystallized in this single moment. Camilla turned at the sound of his footsteps on the wooden deck, her face transforming with a smile that made his political world feel like a distant memory. She wore a simple white dress that floated around her in the ocean breeze, her dark hair wild and free, the antithesis of the carefully groomed political wives and supporters he was used to. "I wasn't sure you'd really come," she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of challenge and affection that had first drawn him to her. The great Governor Stanford, throwing away everything for a scandal in the making. But even as she teased, she moved toward him with the fluid grace that had haunted his dreams. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her hands, the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. This was real for her too, terrifyingly, thrillingly real. Their first kiss was like coming home and stepping off a cliff at the same time. Marcus pulled her close, one hand tangling in her hair as the other pressed against the small of her back, eliminating any space between them. She tasted of tequila and lime, and underneath that, something uniquely Camilla that he had craved during their weeks apart. Her fingers found the knot of his tie, loosening it with practiced urgency. "No more Governor Stanford," she murmured against his lips. "Just Marcus, just us." The tie fell forgotten to the deck as her hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, each touch erasing another layer of his political armor. The ocean breeze carried the scent of jasmine and possibility, and Marcus felt decades of careful control starting to unravel. They barely made it inside the villa, leaving a trail of discarded clothing, his suit jacket, her dress, the carefully pressed shirt that marked him as a public figure. The bedroom opened onto a private terrace, gauzy curtains dancing in the wind as they fell onto sheets that smelled of ocean air and fresh flowers. Camilla's skin glowed golden in the warm light, and Marcus traced its contours with reverence, memorizing every curve and angle. This was so different from their hurried encounters in hotel rooms and hidden corners. Here, they had time, freedom, the luxury of exploration. When she arched beneath him, crying out his name, it wasn't his political title but his true self she called to. And the distinction made him feel more powerful than any election victory. Dawn found them tangled in the sheets, the first light of day painting patterns across their skin through the palm fronds outside. Camilla propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face with the same intensity she brought to her investigations. "You look different here," she observed, tracing a finger along his jawline. "Younger, more real." Marcus caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. But before he could respond, his burner phone buzzed on the bedside table. Reality crashed back as he read David's message. "Senator Holloway, asking questions, says he needs to speak with you urgently." Camilla noticed his tension immediately, her journalist's instincts kicking in. "What is it?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. The moment fractured as Camilla rose from the bed, pulling on his discarded dress shirt. She walked to her laptop, which sat innocuously on a desk overlooking the ocean. "Maybe this is why he's calling," she said, her voice taking on the professional edge that reminded him she was more than just his escape from reality. "Marcus, there's something you need to see." She pulled up a series of documents, and as he moved to look over her shoulder, the familiar scent of her skin mingled with the growing sense of dread in his stomach. Spreadsheets, bank statements, offshore accounts, a web of financial transactions that all led back to familiar names. "Your mentor has been busy," she said softly. "The campaign finances I was investigating, they're just the tip of the iceberg." Hours slipped by as Camilla walked him through her findings, each revelation adding another crack to the foundation of his political life. Senator Holloway hadn't just been guiding his career. He had been using Marcus's rising star to hide a complex network of corruption. Shell companies, kickbacks, money laundering disguised as campaign contributions. The scope of it was staggering. "I don't think you knew about most of this," Camilla said, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. "Holloway kept you clean enough to be believable, dirty enough to be controllable." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every decision, every policy, every careful step in his political dance had been orchestrated to serve someone else's corruption. The weight of these revelations drove them back to bed, seeking comfort in each other's arms. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the Caribbean waters to diamonds, but Marcus barely noticed the paradise surrounding them. His mind raced through years of interactions with Holloway, searching for signs he should have seen. Camilla pressed soft kisses along his collarbone, offering wordless support, but he could feel the investigative journalist in her analyzing, planning. "You know we have to expose this," she finally said, her words vibrating against his skin. "All of it, not just for the story, but because it's right." Her conviction stirred something in him, not just desire, but a long-buried sense of purpose he had almost forgotten. Their discussion was interrupted by another message on the burner phone, this one from Angela Martinez at the Tribune. "Sources saying Governor not in Colorado. Care to comment?" Attached was a photo, grainy but recognizable, of someone who could be Marcus at the Cancun airport. Camilla read it over his shoulder, her body tensing against his. "It's starting," she whispered, and he couldn't tell if he heard fear or excitement in her voice. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the passionate woman who had upended his life, but the fearless journalist who had uncovered a truth he had been too blind or too cowardly to see. In her eyes, he saw both a challenge and a chance for redemption. The sun now hung high in the turquoise sky, its reflection almost blinding on the water. Marcus stood naked at the window, feeling more exposed emotionally than physically. Behind him, Camilla waited for his response. The sheets pooled around her like white waves. They had found paradise, but they had also uncovered a serpent in the garden, corruption that reached back to the very foundations of his career. Every path forward would involve destruction, either of the corrupt system he had unknowingly served or of the newfound truth and love he had discovered with Camilla. As if reading his thoughts, she came to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Whatever you decide," she murmured against his shoulder, "we'll face it together." For the first time in his political career, Marcus Stanford knew exactly what he had to do, and the clarity was both terrifying and liberating. The Mexican afternoon heat pressed against the villa's windows. As Marcus and Camilla hunched over her laptop, their earlier passion temporarily set aside for something equally intense, the pursuit of truth. Spreadsheets and documents covered the glass dining table, a paper trail of corruption that led straight to the heart of Marcus's political career. Camilla's fingers flew across the keyboard, each click revealing another layer of Senator Holloway's elaborate scheme. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a series of transactions. "Every major policy decision your administration made in the last 5 years, environmental regulations, healthcare contracts, infrastructure projects, there's a corresponding payment to one of these shell companies." The implications made Marcus's blood run cold. He wasn't just part of a corrupt system, he had been its unwitting front man. A warm breeze carried the scent of the ocean through the open terrace doors, a jarring contrast to the ugly truth they were uncovering. Marcus loosened his collar, feeling confined despite wearing only a light linen shirt and slacks. "This contract for the new highway project," he said, pointing to a document on screen, "Holloway assured me it went to the lowest qualified bidder." Camilla's laugh was bitter as she pulled up another spreadsheet. The lowest bidder, who was willing to funnel 20% of the contract value through these offshore accounts. See these names? They all trace back to companies controlled by Holloway's family trust. Each revelation felt like another betrayal, another crack in the foundation of everything Marcus had believed about his political career. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of lunch, fresh ceviche and cold beer delivered by the villa's discreet staff. As they ate on the terrace, watching waves crash against the pristine beach below, Camilla's phone buzzed with a message from her editor. "They want to run the story," she said, her voice tight with tension. "They have enough to expose the highway contract corruption, but I've convinced them to wait. This goes deeper, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded, his appetite suddenly gone. "Holloway didn't just corrupt the system," he replied, remembering years of mentorship and manipulation. "He built it this way from the ground up. Every appointment, every endorsement, every campaign contribution, it was all designed to create a network he could control." Camilla reached across the table, taking his hand. The gesture was both comforting and electric, reminding him of everything at stake. Back at the laptop, they discovered a pattern that made Marcus's political success look like a carefully orchestrated fraud. Holloway had been grooming him for decades, using Marcus's clean image and natural charisma to build a facade of legitimacy over his corrupt empire. Campaign donations were laundered through a complex web of shell companies. Policy decisions were shaped to benefit hidden interests. Even Marcus's marriage to Vivian had been subtly orchestrated, her family's old money connections providing another layer of respectability to the scheme. "He didn't just control your career," Camilla said softly, her investigative instincts fully engaged. "He created you, shaped you into exactly what he needed. A popular, respected politician who could be trusted to follow guidance without asking too many questions." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the villa's floor as they dug deeper into the corruption. Marcus's burner phone buzzed periodically with increasingly urgent messages from David. The press was asking questions, Holloway was demanding contact, the party leadership was getting nervous. But each attempt to pressure him back into line only strengthened his resolve to expose the truth. Camilla worked with focused intensity, her journalism training evident in how she methodically connected the dots. Occasionally, their hands would brush as they pointed to different documents, sending sparks of electricity through both of them. The intimacy of their shared purpose was almost as powerful as their physical connection. A breakthrough came in the form of an encrypted email chain Camilla had obtained from a source inside the state's procurement office. The messages revealed a systematic pattern of bid rigging that extended beyond state contracts to federal projects. Holloway wasn't just corrupting our state, Marcus realized, reading through the exchanges. He was building a blueprint for others to follow. These same patterns show up in 3 other states where he has political allies. Camilla nodded grimly, adding the new information to her growing investigation file. This is why he's been so focused on getting you to the national stage. A governor can be contained. A president would give him unprecedented access to federal contracts. The implications of their discoveries kept building as the day wore on. They found evidence of blackmail material gathered on potential threats, systematic suppression of whistleblowers, and a network of compromised journalists who could be counted on to kill unfavorable stories. "How did he miss you?" Marcus asked Camilla, marveling at her ability to penetrate such a carefully constructed system. She smiled, a fierce expression that made his heart race. "Because he underestimated me. A female journalist from a working-class background. He probably thought I could be bought off or scared away." Her determination was intoxicating, and Marcus found himself pulling her away from the laptop for a passionate kiss. They ended up tangled together on the terrace sofa, the corruption evidence temporarily forgotten as they reminded each other what they were fighting for. As evening approached, they faced a critical decision. Camilla's investigation was solid, but publishing would unleash forces neither of them might survive politically. "Once this goes public," she warned, tracing patterns on his chest as they lay together watching the sunset, "there's no going back. Holloway will use every resource he has to discredit us, destroy us." Marcus caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I've spent my career being his puppet," he replied. "Maybe it's time someone cut the strings." The determination in his voice made her kiss him again, hard and fierce, before returning to her laptop with renewed purpose. They had a story to build, and it needed to be bulletproof. The night settled around them as they worked, the sound of waves providing a steady backdrop to their investigation. Marcus's phone had fallen silent, ominously so. Either David had run out of warnings or something bigger was brewing back home. Camilla was putting the finishing touches on her article, her face illuminated by the laptop's glow. The evidence was damning, systematic corruption on a scale that would shake the political establishment to its core. But as Marcus watched her work, he realized something had changed in him. The fear of losing everything, his position, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, had been replaced by something stronger. The desire to finally do something real, something right. The full moon rose over the Caribbean, casting a silver path across the water to their villa. Camilla finally closed her laptop, stretching like a cat after hours of focused work. "It's ready," she said simply. "Once I send this to my editor, every major news outlet in the country will pick it up by morning." Marcus stood at the terrace railing, feeling the warm night air against his skin, knowing these might be his last moments of peace for a long time. Behind him, Camilla's bare feet made no sound on the tile floor as she joined him. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing herself against his back. "Are you ready for this?" she whispered. In answer, he turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. The kiss they shared was both an ending and a beginning. The death of his political life and the birth of something more authentic. "Send it," he said when they finally parted. "It's time for the truth." The first rays of sunrise had barely touched the Caribbean when Marcus's burner phone exploded with notifications. David's messages came in rapid succession, each more urgent than the last. "Tribune running story about your whereabouts. Photos surfacing online. Holloway called emergency party meeting. Need response now." The peace of their Mexican hideaway shattered like glass as reality came crashing in. Beside him in bed, Camilla stirred, instantly alert as she saw his expression. She reached for her own phone, checking her news alerts. The Tribune's headline hit them both like a physical blow. Governor's spiritual retreat. Sources place Stanford in Mexico with investigative journalist. Camilla sprang into action, her journalistic instincts taking over as she pulled up multiple news sites on her laptop. The story was spreading like wildfire across media outlets. Some had photos, grainy surveillance shots from the Cancun airport, a distant capture of them on the villa's terrace, even a blurry image of their kiss at sunset. But worse than the evidence of their affair were the questions beginning to surface about Marcus's connections to Holloway's dealings. Someone was leaking pieces of the corruption story, but in a way that implicated Marcus as a willing participant rather than an unwitting front. "They're trying to get ahead of the story," Camilla said grimly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Holloway's people are spinning this as a scandal to bury the corruption investigation." The villa's landline rang, a sound so unexpected it made them both jump. Only 3 people had that number: David, the head of Marcus's security detail, and Senator Holloway himself. Marcus answered on speakerphone, and Holloway's voice filled the room, smooth as aged bourbon, but with an edge of steel. "My boy," he began, using the paternal tone that had guided Marcus's entire career. "I thought we had an understanding about the importance of discretion." Marcus met Camilla's eyes across the room as Holloway continued. "But don't worry, we can still contain this. I've got a statement prepared. The girl seduced you, manipulated you, all to pursue her vindictive investigation. Play it right, and you'll come out looking like a victim. The party will rally around you." The suggestion turned Marcus's stomach. But before he could respond, his personal cell phone lit up with Vivian's call. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Holloway had obviously coordinated with her. Camilla nodded encouragingly, and Marcus switched to his private line. His wife's voice was controlled, precise, carrying years of political training. "The Women's Auxiliary is meeting in an hour," she said without preamble. "They expect me to defend you, to play the devoted wife standing by her man. Holloway's people have already reached out with talking points." There was a pause, then something unexpected, a soft laugh. "You know what? I'm tired of playing my part in his puppet show. Do what you need to do, Marcus. I'll do the same." The line went dead before he could respond. The morning devolved into a series of crisis management calls. David reported that the party leadership was splitting into factions, some calling for Marcus's immediate resignation, others wanting to close ranks and protect him. The state's ethics committee had convened an emergency session. News vans were parked outside the governor's mansion, the Capitol building, and even Camilla's apartment back home. Their peaceful paradise was rapidly becoming a gilded cage. Every few minutes, another photo would surface online. Marcus and Camilla at a beachfront restaurant, walking on the sand, sharing an intimate moment on their terrace. Each image was accompanied by speculation, innuendo, and increasingly pointed questions about both the affair and the corruption investigation. Camilla paced the villa's main room, her professional calm cracking slightly as she coordinated with her editor. The Tribune was planning to run her full exposé of Holloway's corruption network the next morning, but competing narratives were already muddying the waters. "They're trying to discredit me," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "Conservative blogs are painting me as a seductress with a vendetta. Liberal outlets are focusing on the affair instead of the corruption, and Holloway's pet journalists are suggesting my investigation is politically motivated." She ran her fingers through her hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "We need to change the narrative before they bury the truth under tabloid headlines." A text from Angela Martinez at the Tribune pushed them to action. "Holloway giving press conference in 1 hour. Sources say he's presenting evidence you've been compromised by foreign interests." The implication was clear. They were about to be painted as traitors as well as lovers. Marcus pulled Camilla close, feeling her tremble slightly despite her tough exterior. "I won't let them destroy you," he promised, his lips against her hair. She pulled back to look at him, her eyes fierce. "Then let's destroy them first. We have the truth. Let's use it." They returned to her laptop, where the draft of her exposé waited. It was comprehensive, damning, and most importantly, supported by irrefutable evidence. With a few keystrokes, she could send it to every major news outlet in the country. The decision was made for them by another call from David. "Sir," his voice was urgent, "Holloway's people are moving to freeze your accounts. They're claiming evidence of financial irregularities, using your absence to justify emergency measures." More than that, David reported. There were whispers of criminal investigations, suggestions of grand jury proceedings. The machine that had protected Marcus for so long was turning against him with frightening efficiency. Camilla listened to the call, her expression hardening with each new threat. When Marcus hung up, she was already typing. "Enough," she said firmly. "They want to play hardball. Let's show them what a real investigation looks like." The sun climbed higher in the Mexican sky as they launched their counterattack. Camilla sent her story to her editor with instructions to publish immediately, while Marcus recorded a video statement on his phone. No political polish, no careful scripting, just the raw truth about Holloway's corruption and his own role as an unwitting front man. As Camilla uploaded the video to multiple platforms, Marcus made one final call to the state's Attorney General, a woman who had never been part of Holloway's machine. He provided enough details about the corruption to launch an official investigation, then formally requested whistleblower protection. The dice were cast. There was no going back. The last light of day painted the Caribbean waters blood red as they stood on their terrace, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Marcus's phones, both of them, had finally fallen silent. Either the shock of their countermove had stunned their opponents, or something worse was brewing. Camilla's story was now live, spreading across the internet with the speed of a digital wildfire. His video statement was trending on social media. The peaceful villa had become ground zero for a political earthquake that would reshape the landscape they had left behind. "What happens now?" Camilla asked softly, her hand finding his as they watched darkness creep across the water. Marcus pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, drawing strength from her presence. "Now," he said, "we fight back together." The world exploded overnight. Marcus and Camilla sat side by side on the villa's plush sofa, multiple devices spread before them as they watched their revelations detonate across the media landscape. Every major network had picked up the story. Breaking: Governor exposes massive corruption ring. Senator Holloway named in multi-state fraud scheme. Love affair leads to political earthquake. Camilla's exposé was trending nationally, its carefully documented evidence making it impossible to dismiss as mere scandal. Her editor had done his job well, releasing supporting documents in waves that kept the story fresh and devastating. Meanwhile, Marcus's raw, unscripted video confession had gone viral, its very lack of political polish lending it an authenticity that resonated with viewers. The combination was lethal to the old guard's attempts at damage control. Senator Holloway's hastily called press conference had backfired spectacularly. Standing at the podium where Marcus had so often held court, the old political maestro had appeared shaken, his usual smooth control cracking under aggressive questioning. Every attempt to paint Marcus as compromised or Camilla as a seductress was met with reporters wielding hard evidence from her investigation. The moment that would lead every newscast came when Angela Martinez from the Tribune stood up with documentation of Holloway's offshore accounts. "Senator, would you care to explain why shell companies under your control received millions in kickbacks from state contracts?" The footage of Holloway's face going ashen, of him stumbling away from the podium as reporters shouted questions, was already becoming iconic. David's updates from the Capitol painted a picture of total chaos. The party leadership had fractured, with younger members rushing to distance themselves from Holloway, while his old guard allies desperately tried to maintain control. The state's Attorney General had announced a formal corruption investigation, complete with raids on offices and seizure of documents. Federal authorities were involved now, following the money trail across state lines. Most surprisingly, Vivian had given an impromptu press conference on the mansion's steps that sent new shockwaves through the political establishment. "I've spent 20 years watching Richard Holloway corrupt good people with his particular brand of political poison," she had declared, her elegance weaponized. "Today I choose truth over power. I choose to stand with my husband's decision to expose this corruption, even at the cost of our carefully constructed life." The villa's landline rang again. This time, it was Camilla's editor with news that made her grab Marcus's hand in excitement. The Tribune's website had crashed from the traffic to her story, but not before other major newspapers had picked it up. The New York Times was running a front-page piece titled "The Governor and the Journalist: A Love Story Exposes American Political Corruption." The Washington Post had a team expanding on her investigation, uncovering similar patterns in other states. What had started as a local scandal was becoming a national referendum on political corruption. "You've started a revolution," her editor said, his voice thick with pride. "Every investigative journalist in the country is diving into their state's contracts, looking for Holloway's fingerprints. This is bigger than anyone imagined." Marcus's security detail called next, their professional calm shattered by events. Lead agent Mike Thompson reported that federal marshals had arrived at Holloway's estate with search warrants. "Sir," Mike said, with the hint of a smile in his voice, "I think you should know. They found a hidden room full of files behind his study wall, paper records going back decades. The old man never trusted computers with his real secrets." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Holloway's own paranoia about digital trails had created a physical evidence cache that would be impossible to deny or delete. As Mike continued his report, describing the stream of suits entering and exiting the senator's mansion with boxes of documents, Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The truth was finally coming to light. Camilla worked through the morning with fierce intensity, coordinating with journalists across the country as the story expanded. Her sources were coming forward now, emboldened by the public exposure. Each hour brought new revelations. Judges who had been compromised, regulators who had been bought, journalists who had been paid to kill stories. The web of corruption Holloway had spent decades weaving was unraveling in real time. Marcus watched her work with a mixture of pride and awe, still amazed by the combination of brilliant investigator and passionate woman that had captured his heart. When she finally took a break, coming to curl up beside him on the sofa, he pulled her close and kissed her temple. "You're incredible," he murmured. Her response was to kiss him properly, reminding them both that amid all the political chaos, their connection remained real and electric. The afternoon brought a series of calls from political allies and enemies alike, each trying to position themselves in the new reality. Some offered support, others made threats, but most simply wanted to know how much Marcus knew about their own dealings with Holloway. He directed them all to his official statement, which David had released through proper channels. He would cooperate fully with all investigations and encouraged others to do the same. The implicit message was clear. Those who came forward voluntarily would fare better than those who tried to maintain the old system of lies. Several state legislators had already announced their resignations, trying to get ahead of the inevitable investigations. The political machine was eating itself in its panic to survive. As evening approached, a different kind of message arrived, a handwritten note delivered to the villa by private courier. It was from Senator Holloway himself, written in his distinctive flowing script. "My boy, I taught you everything you know about power, but it seems you've learned something new, the power of truth. Well played. The student has surpassed the master. But remember this, in politics, today's victory can become tomorrow's vulnerability. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" The note was simultaneously a concession and a warning, typical of the man who had shaped Marcus's career. Camilla read it over his shoulder, her arms wrapped around him from behind. "He's trying to plant doubts," she said softly. "Don't let him in your head. Not anymore." The sun set over the Caribbean in a blaze of orange and pink, nature's own celebration of truth's victory over deception. Marcus and Camilla stood on their terrace, watching the light show while monitoring the continuing fallout on their phones. The story showed no signs of slowing. If anything, it was gaining momentum as more people came forward, more connections were revealed, more corruption was exposed. Their private paradise had become the eye of a political hurricane that was reshaping the American political landscape. "Do you regret it?" Camilla asked suddenly, looking up at him. "Giving up everything you built?" Marcus looked down at her, seeing not just the fierce journalist who had exposed the truth, but the woman who had shown him a different kind of power, the power of authentic love and honest purpose. The night settled around them like a warm blanket as they retreated inside, leaving their phones behind for the first time that day. The political earthquake they had triggered would continue without them for a few hours. Marcus pulled Camilla into his arms, needing to feel the reality of her, the truth of what they had found together. "I regret the years I spent being Holloway's puppet," he said, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "I regret the times I looked the other way, telling myself it was just how politics worked. But this," he kissed her softly, then with growing passion, "this is the first thing in my political life I don't regret at all." Camilla's response was to pull him closer, her body molding to his as they celebrated their victory in the most personal way possible. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore, nature's applause for a performance that had finally become real. The villa's dining room had transformed into a war room, laptops and documents covering the elegant teak table as Marcus and Camilla prepared for their next move. The initial shock of their revelations had worn off, and now Holloway's remaining allies were mounting a coordinated counterattack. Conservative media outlets were pushing a narrative of political persecution, portraying the senator as a victim of a love-struck governor's vendetta. Tabloids were digging into Camilla's past, trying to paint her as an opportunistic seductress with a history of targeting powerful men. Even Marcus's mental stability was being questioned, with sources close to the administration suggesting the stress of office had led to a breakdown. The honeymoon phase of their truth-telling was over. Now the real fight would begin. David's morning briefing was grim but determined. "They're calling for an emergency legislative session to begin impeachment proceedings," he reported via secure video call. "Holloway's people are pushing the narrative that you abandoned your duties for a foreign tryst, claiming your corruption allegations are just a smokescreen." But there was hope in his voice as he continued. "However, the federal investigation is moving fast. They've already found documentation confirming most of Camilla's reporting, and more whistleblowers are coming forward every hour." So on screen, David looked exhausted but energized, like a man who had finally chosen the right side of history. "The question is, sir, how do you want to handle your official response? They're demanding you return to face the legislature." Camilla worked her sources tirelessly, her phone buzzing constantly with updates and leads. Fellow journalists were sending her new evidence, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. "Holloway's network went deeper than we realized," she said, scanning through encrypted messages. "Federal investigators just found links to judicial appointments in 3 states. He wasn't just corrupting the executive branch, he was building an entire shadow government." She looked up at Marcus, her eyes bright with the thrill of investigation. "We need to get ahead of this. The more they try to make this about our relationship, the more they can distract from the institutional corruption. We need to change the narrative again." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Vivian, Marcus's wife, had transformed from political partner to powerful ally, using her social connections to devastating effect. Her message was brief but impactful. "The wives talk, darling. Always have. I've got names, dates, and bank accounts that would interest your journalist friend. Holloway's Boys Club wasn't as discreet as they thought." Within an hour, Camilla was on a secure call with Vivian, taking notes as Marcus's wife methodically exposed decades of indiscretions, payoffs, and compromising arrangements. The society hostess had been the perfect spy, gathering intelligence at every charity gala and fundraising dinner. Her memory was flawless, her documentation meticulous, and her motivation now aligned perfectly with their cause. Marcus spent the afternoon recording a series of video statements, each one addressing a different aspect of the scandal. No more polished political performances. He spoke directly, honestly about his role in Holloway's machine and his journey to redemption. Camilla directed the recordings, her journalistic instincts helping him strike the perfect balance between personal confession and public service. "Talk about how you fell in love with the truth first," she suggested, adjusting the laptop's camera angle. "Our relationship grew from that, from finally being honest." When he stumbled over his words, she would touch his hand lightly, grounding him in their shared reality. The resulting videos were powerful in their authenticity, impossible to dismiss as either lovesick ramblings or political calculation. Their strategy session was interrupted by an urgent call from Angela Martinez at the Tribune. "They're moving faster than we expected," she warned. "Holloway's people are pushing through emergency legislation to grant themselves investigative powers. They want to subpoena both of you before a hostile committee." And the implications were clear. They were trying to create a forum where they could attack Camilla's credibility and Marcus's mental state without the protections of regular court procedures. But Angela wasn't finished. "There's more. My sources say they've got a judge ready to issue international warrants, claiming misuse of state resources for your flight to Mexico. They're trying to force you back on their terms." The pressure to return mounted as the day progressed. Marcus's security detail reported suspicious vehicles monitoring the villa from distant public beaches. His political allies were being strong-armed into choosing sides, their loyalty tested with a combination of threats and promises. Even David was feeling the heat, with subtle suggestions that his long career in public service could end in disgrace if he didn't help bring the governor back to face the music. But each attempt at intimidation only strengthened their resolve. Camilla worked her contacts in international media, ensuring their story couldn't be buried by local political machinations. Marcus coordinated with sympathetic law enforcement officials, making sure any return would happen under federal protection rather than state control. As evening approached, they finalized their battle plan. Marcus would return, but on his own terms, with federal whistleblower protection in place and accompanied by a team of independent journalists who would document everything. Camilla would release her next wave of revelations strategically, timed to counteract each of Holloway's planned attacks. They had anticipated every move, prepared for every contingency. Yet as they worked, they kept finding excuses to touch, to connect, as if reassuring themselves that their bond was worth all this chaos. During a brief break, Marcus pulled her onto the terrace, needing a moment away from the strategy and subterfuge. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, holding her close. "They'll come after you hard." Camilla's laugh was fierce and fearless. "Let them try. The truth is bulletproof." The night brought a new challenge. Encrypted messages suggesting that some of Holloway's more dangerous allies were taking matters into their own hands. Their Mexican security team reported increased activity around the villa's perimeter, and local police had noticed unmarked vehicles with suspicious plates in the area. The paradise of their hideaway was becoming a potential trap. Camilla took the threat seriously, moving their most sensitive files to secure cloud storage and establishing dead man switches that would release everything if anything happened to either of them. As they worked to secure their position, the intimacy of their shared danger brought them closer. Each precaution they took together felt like another declaration of commitment, another proof that what they had found was worth protecting. Their final preparation of the night was the most personal, recording video statements to be released if anything went wrong. Marcus spoke directly to his constituents, explaining every detail of how he had discovered Holloway's corruption and why he had chosen to expose it. Camilla documented her investigation process, proving that every revelation was based on solid evidence rather than personal vendetta. When the recordings were complete, they held each other in silence, watching the moonlight play across the waves. The beauty of their surroundings felt surreal compared to the darkness they were fighting, but it also reminded them of what they were fighting for, the chance to live in truth rather than shadows. The breeze off the Caribbean carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine as they finally stepped away from their preparations. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight they needed to remember why they had started this fight. Marcus led Camilla to their bedroom, where the sound of waves provided a constant reminder of the world beyond politics and corruption. As they came together, their passion was tinged with both defiance and tenderness, every touch an affirmation, every kiss a promise. They were no longer just lovers hiding from the world. They were partners in a fight for something bigger than themselves. Let tomorrow bring its challenges. Tonight was for them, for the truth they had discovered together, for the love that had given them the courage to shake the foundations of power. The morning brought dark clouds rolling in from the Caribbean, nature providing an appropriate backdrop for what was to come. Marcus stood on the villa's terrace, adjusting his tie for the first time in days, no longer the polished political prop it had once been, but armor for the battle ahead. Behind him, Camilla coordinated with news outlets across multiple devices, ensuring their counterattack would be perfectly timed. They had chosen to make their stand here, turning their supposed love nest into command central for the final assault on Holloway's corrupt empire. The international press was gathering on the beach below, their cameras ready to broadcast this unprecedented moment to the world. No more hiding, no more strategic retreats. Today, they would face their enemies head-on. The first salvo came from Holloway himself, his face filling every major network as he called an early morning press conference. "It grieves me deeply," he intoned, his voice carrying that familiar paternal disappointment to see a promising public servant fall victim to such obvious manipulation. Governor Stanford's behavior, while concerning, is merely a symptom of a coordinated attack on our political institutions. But even as he spoke, Camilla's team was releasing the first wave of new evidence, documentation showing Holloway's direct involvement in rigging state contracts, complete with audio recordings of the senator himself giving orders. The effect was immediate and devastating. Reporters began receiving the files mid-conference, their questions shifting from sympathetic to aggressive as they confronted Holloway with his own words. Marcus's video address, broadcast simultaneously across multiple platforms, provided a stark contrast to Holloway's political theatrics. He spoke from the villa's study, the ocean visible behind him, a deliberate choice that owned their location while emphasizing transparency. "For years, I was part of a system that traded public trust for private gain," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I didn't build that system, but I allowed it to continue. I accepted the lies we told ourselves about necessary compromises and political realities. That ends today." As he spoke, Camilla's exposé was being updated in real time, each of his revelations supported by irrefutable evidence. The combination of personal confession and journalistic rigor was proving impossible for their opponents to counter. The legislative emergency session convened back in the state capitol, but it wasn't going according to Holloway's plan. As Marcus and Camilla watched via secure feed, representatives who had been expected to support impeachment were instead calling for broader investigations. Vivian's intelligence network had done its work well. Too many legislators had received early morning visits from federal agents, armed with evidence she had provided. The political calculus was shifting rapidly as more officials chose to save themselves rather than protect the old guard. David's text updates became increasingly optimistic. "They're turning on each other. The dam is breaking." Even as he reported this, more resignations were being announced, each one accompanied by promises to cooperate with investigators. Camilla's editor called with news that made her grab Marcus's hand in excitement. Their story had just won the online equivalent of a nuclear war. Every attempt to discredit them was being met with overwhelming public support and new evidence. The hashtag Standard for Truth was trending nationally, with citizens sharing their own stories of encountering corruption in state government. More importantly, journalists across the country were finding similar patterns in their states, suggesting Holloway's model had been more widely adopted than anyone had suspected. "You haven't just exposed one corrupt network," her editor said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given people a blueprint for identifying corruption in their own backyards. This is becoming a movement." The afternoon brought a series of rapid-fire developments that left them barely time to breathe. Federal agents raided Holloway's private banking office, emerging with boxes of documents. 3 state judges suddenly recused themselves from any cases involving the administration. The party's national leadership issued a carefully worded statement, distancing themselves from both Holloway and the state organization. But most surprisingly, a group of young legislators from Marcus's own party held a press conference announcing the formation of a reform caucus. Their spokesman, a freshman representative, spoke directly to the cameras. "Governor Stanford and Ms. Estrada have shown us that the price of power doesn't have to be our integrity. We choose truth over corruption, public service over private gain." As pressure mounted, Holloway made his final play, a desperate attempt to regain control through sheer force of personality. He demanded a live, one-on-one interview with Marcus on national television. The old political maestro clearly believed he could still outmaneuver his protege in a direct confrontation. After quick consultation with their team, Marcus and Camilla decided to accept, but with one condition: Camilla would moderate the discussion. The senator's agreement came too quickly, suggesting he didn't understand that walking into the arena with both of them was like stepping into a trap of his own making. They spent an hour preparing, not with political talking points, but with simple, devastating truth. "Just be real," Camilla advised, straightening Marcus's tie one last time. "That's the one thing he's never learned how to fight." The interview was a political execution carried out with surgical precision. Every attempt by Holloway to deploy his old tricks, the fatherly concern, the appeals to loyalty, the subtle threats, was met with clear evidence and direct questions. When he tried to paint Marcus as lovesick and compromised, Camilla produced documentation showing how Holloway had used similar accusations to destroy other whistleblowers. When he attempted to question her motives, Marcus calmly detailed how his own journey from enabler to exposer had begun long before their relationship. The final blow came when Holloway attempted to invoke party loyalty, and Marcus responded with the names of young politicians whose careers Holloway had destroyed to protect his corrupt system. By the interview's end, the senator appeared physically diminished, his power evaporating in the face of unrelenting truth. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Within hours of the interview, federal prosecutors announced multiple indictments. Party leaders who had been defending Holloway that morning were now calling for his resignation by evening. The emergency legislative session was suspended as more officials were called in for questioning. Marcus's political career might be over, but he had accomplished something far more significant. He had helped break a corrupt system that had seemed unshakable just days ago. As the news updates slowed and the immediate crisis passed, he and Camilla found themselves alone on their terrace, watching another Caribbean sunset. "Was it worth it?" she asked softly, though they both knew the answer. Instead of replying, he pulled her close and kissed her, pouring all his certainty into the gesture. The night settled around them like a blessing, the sound of waves washing away the tension of the day. They had won the major battle, but both knew the war wasn't over. There would be more fights ahead as the old system died and a new one struggled to be born. Yet, as they held each other under the stars, neither felt afraid. They had discovered something more powerful than political machinery, the combination of truth and love, each making the other stronger. Marcus touched Camilla's face gently, seeing in her eyes the same fierce determination that had first drawn them together. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me how to be real." Her answer was to pull him inside, away from the world they had shaken to its foundations, reminding him that their private truth was just as important as their public victory. 1 month after their dramatic confrontation with Holloway, Marcus and Camilla stood in the governor's office for the last time. The room felt smaller somehow, its grandeur diminished now that they understood the true cost of power. Marcus was signing his formal resignation, his hand steady as he ended his political career on his own terms. The federal investigation had cleared him of direct involvement in Holloway's corruption, but the truth remained. He had been part of a broken system, and stepping down was the honorable choice. Camilla watched from across the room, her presence both support and witness to this final act of his political life. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in the air, nature's own spotlight on this moment of transition. David orchestrated the resignation with his usual efficiency, but there was something different in his manner now. Respect untinged by deference, loyalty freely given rather than politically required. He had already accepted a position with the federal task force investigating corruption in state governments, his intimate knowledge of political machinery now serving the cause of reform. "You know," he said, gathering the signed documents, "when you first hired me, I thought I was joining the next phase of politics as usual. Instead, you taught me that the system can change if enough people find the courage to demand better." His handshake with Marcus was firm, his nod to Camilla acknowledging her role in catalyzing that change. Their former chief of staff had found his own path to redemption. Vivian met them in the mansion's private quarters, where staff were already packing the personal items she had selected to keep. The divorce papers had been finalized that morning, their marriage ending with the same practical efficiency that had characterized it. But there was warmth in her smile as she handed Marcus a thick folder. "My final gift to the cause," she explained. "Everything I gathered over the years about corruption in the party's national organization. I think your journalist friends will find it interesting." She had emerged from the scandals stronger, her social networks now serving a higher purpose than mere political advancement. The society hostess had become a formidable ally in the fight for transparency. Her upcoming memoir already generating uncomfortable discussions in Washington's corridors of power. The afternoon brought a parade of farewells and new beginnings. Young legislators from the Reform Caucus came to pay their respects, each carrying stories of how the exposure of Holloway's network had created space for genuine public service. Camilla's fellow journalists dropped by with updates on investigations spreading to other states, the domino effect of truth-telling gaining momentum across the country. Even Angela Martinez from the Tribune appeared, sharing news that her expansion of Camilla's initial investigation had been nominated for a Pulitzer. The office that had once been the seat of corrupt power was transforming into something else, a waypoint for those dedicated to positive change. As evening approached, Marcus and Camilla found themselves on the mansion's back terrace, sharing a quiet moment before their final departure. The garden where he had once hosted carefully choreographed political events now felt like a different place entirely. The setting sun painted the sky in shades reminiscent of their Mexican hideaway, bringing back memories of their first days of freedom together. "Do you ever regret it?" Camilla asked, echoing her question from those early days. Trading power for truth, Marcus pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of jasmine that now meant home to him. "Not for a second," he replied, and meant it more than ever. They had lost the trappings of influence, but gained something far more valuable, the ability to look in the mirror without flinching. The news of Senator Holloway's plea deal had broken that morning, adding a sense of closure to their last day in the Capitol. The old political maestro had finally run out of moves, his network of corruption unraveling thread by thread. But even in defeat, he had managed one final power play, trading his comprehensive knowledge of corruption in other states for a reduced sentence. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The man who had built his empire on others' secrets was ending his career by exposing them all. His final message to Marcus, delivered through his lawyers, was typically enigmatic. You chose truth over power. Maybe that's the greatest power of all. Their new life was already taking shape beyond the political arena. Camilla had accepted a position leading a new investigative journalism initiative focused on exposing corruption across multiple states. The Holloway scandal had created unprecedented public appetite for governmental transparency, and she was determined to ride that wave toward lasting change. Marcus had been offered a visiting fellowship at several universities, institutions eager to have him teach about political reform and ethical governance. But more importantly, they had found something neither had expected in the midst of all the chaos: a partnership based on shared purpose as much as passion. The sun had almost set when they finally walked out of the governor's mansion together, declining the usual security escort. Let the world see them leave as they had chosen to live, openly, honestly, hand in hand. News cameras tracked their exit, but neither played to the publicity anymore. They had learned that truth had its own power, requiring no political polish or careful staging. Their car waited at the curb, packed for the drive to their new home in a quiet university town where they could build something authentic together. As Marcus opened Camilla's door, she pulled him down for a kiss that made the photographer's cameras click frantically. Let them capture this moment. It was real, like everything else they now chose to share with the world. The drive out of the capital city felt like crossing a threshold into a new life. Marcus watched the familiar landmarks recede in the rearview mirror: the Capitol Dome, the government buildings, the corridors of power he had once walked so confidently. But instead of regret, he felt only lightness, possibility. Beside him, Camilla was already working on her laptop, following leads for her next investigation. Some habits died hard, but this one was worth keeping. They had discovered that love could be strengthened by shared purpose, that passion could fuel more than just personal desire. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, their bond forged in the fire of choosing truth over power, love over ambition, reality over appearance. The night cradled them as they drove toward their future, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Everything that had seemed important in Marcus's political life, the power, the influence, the careful manipulation of truth, had been replaced by something far more precious: the freedom to be authentic, the strength to stand for what was right, the love of a woman who had seen through every facade to the real person beneath. Camilla reached over and took his hand, her touch both familiar and thrilling. The story of the governor who abandoned his state for love had become something else entirely, a tale of redemption, of truth's triumph over corruption, of two people who found each other while fighting for something bigger than themselves. As the city lights faded behind them, Marcus Stanford, no longer governor but finally fully himself, smiled into the darkness. The best stories he had learned weren't about power at all. They were about finding the courage to be real and someone to be real with.